Hello everybody, welcome back to Start McCleary Music. I'm Sean, and today we are going to talk about a band, a rock band that is one of the most successful acts and most popular acts in music history, and that is AC/DC. We're going to talk about their albums, talk about the band members, talk about their success, talk about how they made it from the bottom to the top, and all that good stuff. So, why don't we get started? AC/DC was founded by two brothers, Angus Young, born on March 31st, 1955, and Malcolm Young, born on January 6, 1953. The brothers were originally born in Glasgow, Scotland, but during the Big Freeze of 1963, which was one of the worst winters in Scotland, the family saw a TV ad of living a different life in Australia and offered assisted travels. They officially left Scotland in June of 1963 and moved to Burwood, Australia. Malcolm and Angus's older brother George Young, born on November 6th of 1946, was the first to learn guitar and became a member of the band called the Easybeats in 1964. The Easybeats were one of the most successful bands in Australia in the late 60s. During that time, Malcolm Young also decided to play guitar and joined his first band called Velvet Underground. Not the New York band, by the way. Angus Young wasn't a big fan of school, so he dropped out at the age of 15, and the first instrument he played was a banjo where he restrung with 6 strings. Shortly after, his mother bought him a cheap acoustic guitar. In 1970, he bought his first famous Gibson SG from a music shop. A couple years later, in 1972, George Young and his friend Harry Vanda, who became their future producers, started a new band called the Marcus Hook Roll Band, with Angus and Malcolm joining in. The band wasn't really successful though, it only lasted for 2 years. They released only one album that was called Tales of Old Granddaddy in 1973. Not much is known about this album, as George claimed that they had a lot of alcohol during the recording session, except for Angus. Shortly later, in November of 1973, Malcolm and Angus decided to start their own band, which they appropriately called AC/DC. They got the name after their sister saw AC/DC initials on a sewing machine, which it stands for alternating current and direct current, which they felt the name symbolizes their power performance in their music. The band's first lineup was Malcolm Young on rhythm guitar, Angus Young on lead guitar, Larry Vann on bass, Colin Burgess on drums, and Dave Evans on vocals. AC/DC's first gig was on New Year's Eve of 1973 at Checkers nightclub. By this time, Angus tried some costumes on stage like Spider-Man, Zorro, a gorilla, and even Superman. But his sister suggested him to use his schoolboy uniform, which he still uses today. Though Angus is more known and visible of the brothers, Malcolm was the brains and leader of the band. In early 1974, most band members dressed in a glam or satin outfit. Later that year, the band has released their first single called Can I Sit Next to You Girl, with Rockin' in the Parlor on the other side. But AC/DC had some struggles. Colin Burgess was fired on February of 1974 for being drunk on stage. Larry Vann was the only American to be in the band who was also fired for unknown reasons. They were replaced by Ron Carpenter on drums and Neil Smith on bass. Australian promoter Michael Browning said that Dave Evans was not a good fit for the band and Dennis Laughlin quit as the manager, and as a result they were in Adelaide with no money. Later, Browning gave him another gig at a club called the Hard Rock Club. Following the gig, the band decided to stop doing the glam rock image and went more towards hard blues rock. After this move, they now know that Dave Evans was not a good fit for the band, and Evans had a physical altercation with the manager. Later in 1974, at the Paraka Hotel, brother George Young introduced another vocalist who was a cool man named Bon Scott. Since they were looking for a new singer to replace Evans, and they said that Bon Scott was the best pick. He was charismatic, creative, and friendly. And he was in the bands like the Spectres, the Valentines, and the Fraternities, but was not having a good relationship with the fraternity band and suffered a motorcycle accident and was working odd jobs during his recovery. Like Angus and Malcolm, Bon Scott was also from Scotland and later moved to Australia. And after watching their performance at a hotel, Bon Scott was really interested in joining the band. But after the brothers think he was too old for the band, with him being born on July 9th, 1946, and Bon Scott thinks they were a bit too inexperienced and too young. But after their first meeting, Bon Scott got a job as working for a chauffeur for the band. But he wasn't a chauffeur for long. Shortly after, Dave Evans became more and more jealous and had a bad relationship with the manager. And then around September, Dave Evans was officially released from the band. And then AC/DC was auditioning for a new singer, with Bon Scott included. And the brothers were impressed by Bon Scott's performance, and on October 24th, 1974, Bon Scott was the official lead singer. Neil Smith left the band and was replaced by Rob Bailey and Peter Clark on drums. Unlike Dave Evans and Bon Scott's previous band, Fraternity, Bon, Angus, and Malcolm quickly became good friends, and on November of 1974, they finally recorded their first album in Albert Studios. The album was called High Voltage, released on February 17, 1975, with great songs like Baby Please Don't Go, You Ain't Got a Hold on Me, and Show Business. It was only released in Australia, but it sold an impressive 350,000 copies, having a 5-star platinum and peaked at number 14 in the charts. A few months later, the drummer and the bassist were later dismissed, and they were replaced with Phil Rudd on drums and Mark Evans on bass. Later that year, on December 1st, 1975, they released their second album, also only released in Australia, called TNT, which had more hits than their first album. They had Live Wire, the title song, re-recording of Can I Sit Next to You Girl, and of course their most famous song, It's a Long Way to the Top, which was Bon Scott's signature song. The album was a huge success, selling over 600,000 copies and receiving a 9-star platinum and becoming one of the biggest, most popular rock bands in Australia. In 1976, once their popularity grew, they want to be more famous around the world. They signed an international deal with Atlantic Records and released their first international album on April 30th, 1976, once again called High Voltage. They eventually released it in the States in May 14th of 76, selling 3 million copies in the US and peaked in the Billboard at 146, but the album received mixed reviews at the time. Their first country they traveled to was London, England, but their tour was cancelled due to the death of Paul Krossoff. So they played in small venues until their label organized the Lock Up Your Daughters tour. While at London, there were rumors that the band was punk rock, though they denied, and as they disliked punk rock, they later developed and maintained a cult following in the UK. Later in 1976, the band released their third album called Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, released in September 20th, 1976 in Australia and internationally on December 17th, 1976. But the American label did not like the album, and it was not released in the US until March of 1981. But in the US, it sold 6 million copies, peaking at number 3 in the US Billboard, and sold an additional million worldwide. The album had great songs like the title song, the slow blues song called Ride On, and also Jailbreak, receiving critical acclaim. But by 1977, the band decided to go with harder riffs and a more powerful hard rock sound. And March 21st of 1977, they released their fourth album called Let There Be Rock, which was more powerful than their previous albums. It was released internationally on July 25th, 1977. They had great songs like the title song, Dog Eat Dog, Bad Bad Boogie, and Whole Lotta Rosie. It was the last album to feature Mark Evans, who was fired in May of 1977 due to musical indifferences and clashes with Angus. He was replaced by English bassist named Cliff Williams. They eventually played their first concert in America on July 27, 1977 at Texas, 2 days after the album was released. By 1978, with their new bass player, they already performed in the US and they were beginning to get international fame. And on May 5th of 1978, they released their fifth album called Power Rage, which, like Let There Be Rock, had harder riffs and a more powerful sound. Great songs like Rock and Roll Damnation, Riff Raff, and Sin City. But Power Rage was the least successful album in the Bon Scott era, only selling 1 million copies in the US and peaked at 133 in the US Billboard. But remains an instant classic and being Malcolm Young's and Cliff Williams' favorite album. Even Keith Richards said that this was his favorite album. It was the last album to feature Harry Vanda and George Young as the producers, but it also received very positive reviews. And like the last album to feature Harry and George until 10 years later, I should say. And later in 1978, AC/DC released their first album called If You Want Blood, You've Got It, released on October 13th, 1978 in Europe, November 21st, 1978 in North America, and November 27th of 1978 in Australia. It was a concert on April 30th of 1978 in Glasgow, Scotland at an Apollo Theatre. But next year in 1979, the band got their new producer, Mutt Lange, and finally had a breakthrough in America with their sixth studio album, Highway to Hell, released on July 27th, 1979, which it had critical acclaim on all their songs. Great songs like their title song, Touch Too Much, Walk All Over You, Girls Got Rhythm, and an infamous song, Night Prowler. Throughout history, it was AC/DC's second best-selling album, selling 7 million copies in the US, peaking at number 17 in the US Billboard. Unfortunately, this was the last album to feature Bon Scott, with his last performance being on January 27th, 1980 in Mayflower Theater. Following the tour, the band began to work on their next album, Back in Black, with Scott accompaniment on the drums rather than the lyrics. His last known recording was an improvised version of Ride On while he was jamming with his friends. Then, on February 18th, February 19th of 1980, Scott was in a club called The Music Machine at London. And that night, he went through an all-night drinking binge, and then he was then left and passed out in the back of his friend's car, where he was left asleep that night. Later on February 19th, his friend found Bon in the back of the car, but he would never wake up, and was taken to a hospital, and unfortunately he was found dead on arrival. His death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning and death by misadventure, but there's still conspiracies about his death to this day.